Hey folks, welcome to this episode of Home Health and Hobby. If you're new to this channel, it's all in the name. I am formally trained in the culinary arts, but I love working with my hands and I love bringing you guys along with me. In this video, we're going to be making bagels, and we're going to be doing an introduction to baker's percentages in order to give you the ability to make better than restaurant quality bread right in your own home kitchen. Now to start off with, you're going to need 5 ingredients. You're going to need flour, water, salt, yeast, and a sweetener. Now, in this case, we're going to be using barley malt syrup, although you could use honey, molasses, sorghum syrup, or any other thick, dark sweetener. Now, I really believe that the barley malt syrup gives it that classic, quintessential bagel flavor that you're looking for. But in a pinch, if you don't have it, you can always use whatever you got. Baker's percentages. Now, this one right here is a little bit intimidating, I think, to those who have been raised on volumetric measuring. It's pretty easy. Let's break it down into a much more understandable step-by-step approach here. Now, flour. Flour is always going to be 100%. That is the total amount of flour for the recipe, and every other ingredient following is a percentage of that flour. So, we're making a scaled down recipe from 5 pounds to 2 pounds. I generally find that it is easier to measure in grams, so I'm going to recommend that you get yourself a digital scale. The digital scale usually comes with a tare function, and you can convert from pounds to ounces to grams with the push of a button. That's what mine does. I have a few other scales that I've gotten at the big box home store. They're generally going to run you about $15 to $35, some up to $50 depending on your budget. And make sure it's digital. That way you can do those conversions and you can use a tare function. Alright, so the first ingredient that's going to allow for good gluten development, which we will get into in a second. This is a 58% hydration dough. That simply means that 100% of the flour is going to be hydrated by 58% of its weight in water. So 908 grams is going to have 58% hydration, meaning that we take 908 times 0.58, and that will get us our amount of water in grams or milliliters, they're equal, which is 526 grams of water. We're going to take that water and we're going to keep it separate from all the ingredients until we get over to the mixer. Yeast. This is what gives the bread its leavening. It is the leavener. And in this recipe, we have a 0.4% by weight in the amount of yeast. So that means we take 908 on our calculator and we multiply it by 0.004. Remember, we're carrying the decimal over 2 decimal places. And that's going to give us approximately 4 grams. 3 to 4 grams on the yeast is not really going to matter too much. We're not going to get super nitpicky. Salt. This one is really important because the salt is going to give the bread its flavor. If you don't, the bread is going to have a really flat flavor. It's not really going to have much of a taste, and you're going to notice its absence, but you will not notice its presence. So don't leave out the salt. We have a 2% salt solution here. So again, we take 908 times 0.02. That gives us approximately 19 grams. I think it's 18.21, but salt by weight means that we can use whatever kind of salt we have. We don't have to worry about it being kosher or table salt or pickling salt or Himalayan salt, whatever you've got. Salt out of the grinder, which is pointless by the way. And we're gonna use the weight measurement here because volumetrically speaking, it doesn't really matter because kosher salt, you'll have a higher volume than you would of table salt. Barley malt. This is the next ingredient that I'm not really super picky on as far as the weight is concerned. It calls for 1% barley malt in this recipe as a sweetener. It's also going to give a little bit of a kick for the yeast to feed off of as it's rising. I went a little bit overboard, but again, 1%, 908 times 0.01, and that gets us our 9 grams. Once we've measured out our malt syrup, we're not going to put this away. We're going to keep this aside. We were going to need it later, but that's it. We are pretty much done with our ingredients. We're going to put everything aside. we're gonna go on over to the mixer. All right, let's talk about mixing. I'm gonna be using a commercial stand mixer. Of course, it's 4 feet tall, but don't let that intimidate you. You can use this in a countertop KitchenAid mixer, whatever kind you've got. Basically, the same thing. We're going to be using a time length on the mixing times here. We're not just going to throw it in and let it go until it comes to a dough. If you don't have a commercial mixer, if you don't have a countertop mixer, you can use your hands. The only difference is that it is going to take a little bit more time. You can start that method off by stirring it all up with a wooden spoon and then bringing it all together by kneading it with hand. I'd say maybe 15 to 20 minutes of hand kneading. Now, all into the mixer go the ingredients, and on slow speed, we're gonna have a 4-minute time, and then we're gonna bump it up to medium speed for a remaining 5 minutes, for 9 minutes total of mixing. How do we know it's done? We're gonna take a small piece of that dough and we're gonna stretch it out between our fingers. This is called the Windowpane Test for obvious reasons. We're gonna take that dough, we're gonna stretch it out as thin as we can and make sure that it holds together and it creates a thin membrane, and we can see the light coming through it. As you can see there, the sunlight is coming through it, hence the Windowpane Test. All right, let's move on to the forming of the bagels. I'm gonna do 2 different shapes here. I've got a baguette shape in mind, and I've got a bagel shape, the classic shape, of course. I'll tell you why I've split them up into 2 different shapes here in a second, but generally the process is the same. It's just the shaping that's different. We're going to take the entire amount of dough after it's come out of the mixer, and we're going to weigh the entirety of the dough ball. I want a baker's dozen, so that's 13. I'm going to divide the entire weight in grams by 13 to get myself an amount in grams that I want each dough ball to weigh. Now, to get that classic bagel shape, I prefer the rolling method. I take a piece of dough and I wrap it around my middle 3 fingers, and then I press that seam underneath the padding of my fingers against the countertop, and I roll it. And then the dough's a little bit sticky, so I slap it off my fingers, and that generally makes it easier to come. I sometimes pinch and crimp the seam together a little bit. We're gonna place these over off to the side covered so that the dough does not form a skin, it doesn't dry out. And for the baguette shapes, we're going to take those and we're gonna kind of press them out. We're gonna stretch them out lengthwise, maybe about 8 inches, fold one side in and then the other into thirds, almost like an envelope shape. We're gonna press that dough down into sort of a rectangular shape, and we're gonna take that farthest portion of the dough and we're gonna roll it back towards us. That's gonna allow the crumb structure, that is the interior of the bread, to come into a nice uniform shape. We're gonna pull it towards us with our fingers, pressing down as it comes closer to us until we get a nice rolled out log. We're gonna place that baguette shape seam side down on our silicone baking sheet or parchment if that's what you're using. The reason we're doing this is because it gives it an extremely consistent crumb structure. Now, whatever shape you decide to use, we're gonna put these on a silicone lined baking sheet, and we're gonna spray that silicone liner with some non-stick, non-sponsored cooking spray. We're gonna cover these and we're going to put them into the fridge. Now, this is where the last ingredient comes in. Patience. This is really important. This allows for flavor development. We have a commercial yeast here that's generally really good at leavening, but not good at flavor development. So we're going to let the dough rise slowly in the fridge over the course of the next 6 hours. You can go 12 hours, 18 hours. I generally won't go longer than 24 because if they go longer, they generally overproof. The fridge is going to keep the dough from rising too fast. That is important. This is how flavor develops. If you wanted bagels now, you could let these rise on the silicone baking sheet, foregoing the step in the fridge for about an hour, hour and a half. And then we get to the next step. That's boiling the bagels. After we pull out the bagels of the fridge, after they've gone through their slow fermentation process, we're gonna pull them out about an hour before we wanna bake them. As soon as we take them out of the oven, we're going to preheat our oven to 500 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 260 degrees Celsius for those of you across the pond. And we're gonna allow that oven to come up to temperature, and about 40 minutes after we pulled them out of the fridge, we're going to put on a shallow skillet with some water in it, add in some of that malt syrup that I had you set aside, and we're going to boil the bagels with this malt syrup in it. You again can use sugar, honey, you can use that malt beverage that you can find in your Latino, Mexican, South American section of your grocery store. This is an important step that gives the bagel its classic texture. What's happening here is the starches in the bagel are gelatinizing. It creates sort of a molecular mesh on the outside of the bagel. When the bagels are put into the oven, the yeast is going to give one last hoorah, and it's going to give it what's called oven spring. It's where the yeast finally does its final rise. And what happens in normal baking, if they aren't bagels, they will generally rise up in the oven. But since we're boiling that starch in the outside of the surface of the bagel, that oven spring won't have anywhere to push the dough, so it generally makes a nice tight skin, and as that heat sets the gelatin on the outside of the bagel, it gives it that shiny texture, gives it that dense texture within the inside of the bagel, giving it that, again, classic quintessential soft and chewy texture that you find in a good bagel. Now, as we pull them out of the boiling solution here, we're going to put them on an unlined baking sheet. That is important because 500 degrees is the temperature of our oven. Those silicone mats that we let them proof on, those have, generally speaking, a 400 degree threshold. I don't put my silicone mats in the oven above that temperature, so onto an unlined baking sheet they go. Into the oven for about 15 minutes or until golden brown and delicious. As soon as they come out of the oven, I generally like to take them right off and put them on a cooling rack or put them on a cool surface so that they can cool down before cutting into them. I find that that's pretty important to do because if you don't, they will stick to the unlined baking sheet. Because remember that outside starch gelatinizes, and that's a form of glue. So you basically want to get them off so that you can let them cool from all directions, including the underneath side. If you have a wire baking rack, put them on those for about 15, 20, 30 minutes and you'll be ready to have bagels. So you've made your bagels. Let's find out a way to enjoy them even more. What I like to do, I like to sprinkle them with some capers. Capers! Put on some smoked delicious salmon. Wild caught, of course, for ethical reasons. I generally don't like farmed salmon because of what they feed them. It's pretty nasty if you look into it. And then finally, I take some pickled onions. Those I make myself. I just take some distilled white vinegar, add in a spoonful of some raw sugar, a spoonful of salt, and then I basically just let that come up to temperature until all of that sugar and salt is dissolved, and I pour them over those onions for about 10-15 minutes before I use them, and then I put them right on top of those bagels. And that bagel baguette shape I like because my mustache gets dirty from the shape of a classic bagel, trying to bite into it. Finally, you can also just spread these with some cream cheese and some fermented pepper paste. This is fermented chipotle pepper paste that I made myself. That will also be in another video. And then finally, one of my favorite childhood ways to enjoy a bagel is a bagel pizza. I take some sauce from some tomatoes that I boiled and concentrated down out of the garden in the backyard, and I add on some cheese, some chopped up pepperoni, put it underneath the broiler for a few minutes on low, and you've got yourself some fixins that are really, really good. Guys, thanks for watching this video. I hope that it was entertaining and educational for you. Find me on Instagram at Chef Nicholas J for all of my food related projects, and at the Bee Pimp for my honeybee keeping endeavors. Hopefully you guys will learn something from all three of my social media platforms. Thanks again for watching. I'll catch you on the next video.